Hi, this is Against Everyone with Connor Habib, a podcast featuring my conversations with countercultural figures and presenting complex spiritual, political, and philosophical ideas and their intersections in an engaging and accessible way. I can't believe that this is the 150th episode of this show. So, I'm going to just talk for a while on this episode, and I'm going to go pretty in-depth about the occult view of the dead, dying, death, its political importance, all that. So, obviously we are living in a time where there's a kind of mass consciousness about death and the dead that's permeated our everyday actions, our laws, the political sphere. And I wanted to lay to rest, just for this episode, the podcast as it is with a guest, with a living, and so instead have the dead as guests on the show. Now, I'm not going to do a Ouija board. In fact, I'm going to speak out against that a little bit towards the end of the episode. But this is more about inviting the dead in, understanding the dead, the presence of death in our psyche, and talking with the dead, and how all that is the most important, or one of the most important tasks of our time. There are multiple layers to this, of course. On the one hand, you could turn to the death positive movement to understand some of this, which has been spearheaded by my good friend Caitlin Doty, who's been on the show multiple times. Think about how differently we would have handled disaster and corpses and funeral rites and rituals and regulations throughout the past year if we had a different feeling about death. Or you can think about death from a psychoanalytic perspective. Peter Rollins, Todd McGowan, Elliot Morgan, people have been on the show, certainly do that. And we can think about the ways our politics and everyday lives would be changed if we accepted the Freudian concept of the death drive, or the Lacanian concept of the death drive, and the lack, accepting the presence of absence and the longing for absence in our lives. That probably would have changed things in the past year. But I want to present here a partial picture of death from a non-materialistic and occult perspective. One that is at once loving and warm, I hope, but also urgent. So, the dead. The view that I'm going to present is brought together by understanding occultism and occult texts, but also my own experiences with death and the dead, direct teachings from spiritual thinkers, and philosophy and critical theory. This is probably as close to a sort of theology as I'll come on the show. I try to be as clear as possible, but I can, of course, imagine a response to this that takes it as absurd or stupid or whatever. But I hope instead that even if it sounds kind of nuts to you, that it is at least provocative, at least interesting, and at least that there are new directions here for any of you listening. We're going to take a few steps here. Those steps are, first, just addressing the difficulty of the path ahead in this episode. Second, thinking through what life is, first, before we discuss death. Third, what happens when we die, both for the dead and the living, according to an occult perspective. Fourth, what the relationship between the living and the dead can be. And fifth, what this means for our politics and philosophies, which will extend into, I guess, sixth, how to interact with the dead. So the difficulty first, the path here. One of the main missions of this show is to spiritualize our understanding of forces we consider to be worldly, political forces, cultural forces, economic forces, to try to present what those would look like if we had a genuinely non-materialistic view. And it's important to do this in a way that expresses a bridge between the materialistic worldview, because I find, first of all, that a lot of people that listen to the show have a materialistic worldview, so it's important to have a bridge or a ladder there for that purpose, but also because I find so much value in the materialistic and scientistic worldview. I don't think we should throw them out. I think we should learn from them, accept their limits, and move on. if what I present is simply just to be believed, I don't think that would be useful. I think that having a sort of jump from, okay, you have a generally materialistic worldview, now believe in all this stuff I'm saying. I don't think that that's really helpful. I also think that we have to create this bridge with the deficiencies of the magical worldviews and pagan worldviews in mind. Specifically, I mean neo-pagan worldviews, because they represent, I think, too often a kind of fuzzy materialism. What would a real non-materialistic view mean? So it's a bit like making a bridge with holes in it, or a terrain with holes in it. There has to be materialism in the expression here, but there also have to be these positive voids of spirituality as I proceed. It's to give you all the option to sort of have the solid ground to sit on as we go forward, and also to shout into the void every once in a while if you need to. Yeah. So that's just my concession to anybody that would not go along this path with me on their own, without some footholds in the world that they're used to. Okay. I think I've apologized enough for everything that's about to come. Now, about life. To express something about death, one has to start with an expression of life. What I'll do to express this is to talk about something I'm going to refer to again and again in this episode as the constitutive forces. What do I mean by that? Let's start with an acorn. When you plant an acorn into the ground, it doesn't just become a tree on its own. It is recognized as a point of emphasis. I plant the acorn, and the soil forces, the wind and rain forces, the sun and shade forces come to play. It's as if these forces turn a kind of attentiveness to the point. The acorn becomes a point of emphasis that unfolds in conjunction with those forces into becoming a tree. Now let's take that on a human level, and I'm going to tell you about one of my experiences. I talked about this a bit on episode 116 with the occultist and veterinarian and acupuncturist. Those are great credentials. Ari Torreson. That's one of my favorite episodes of the show, so go listen to it if you haven't yet. But I'm going to talk about an experience I had when I was in Vietnam. I was sitting in the hotel room, and I saw a gecko on the wall. And I was just kind of looking at it. And then suddenly, it was very quick and very intense. I was looking back towards where I was sitting through the eyes of the gecko. But more than that, it wasn't just that I was looking through the eyes of the gecko. I began to kind of become inside of, or identified with, or whatever, everything in the room. The floor beneath me, beneath my feet, the seat I was sitting in, the air around me, the light and the way it was cast across me, and the objects that were obfuscating it or creating obstacles to its passage, the walls of the room, the space outside the room, the sounds. And they were all turned towards the place where I was sitting, and apprehending it as a kind of a point of emphasis, like that acorn. Now, I say this happened suddenly, but of course this is also happening after like decades of spiritual practice. And I had similar events like this in the past, but this one was quite specific, and I think goes the furthest to explain what I'm talking about. Suddenly, everything was attending to where I was. Here's another way of saying this. We are addresses. In the words of my mentor, Lynn Margulies, the biologist, geoscientist, etc., identity is not an object. It is a process with addresses for all the different directions and dimensions in which it moves. Identity is not an object. It is a process with addresses Now, I'm going to take that further and say that we are addresses. So this is true scientifically, but it's also true spiritually. As so often, science can reflect the deeper spiritual truth. We are addresses. All these constitutive forces reaching towards this point of emphasis that is us, like that acorn. Of course, it's much more complex because of the interiority of our lives, the ways we move, and what we contain within us, and the kinds of relationships we have. So, what happens to the address of those constitutive forces? What happens when we decondense in death? In other words, when those forces stop attending to us because we die. And something happens to our physical body, but what happens to the rest of us? Well, let me talk about what happens for the living first when somebody dies, since that's the side of death we're all on until that one that we get individually later, that death. When someone dies, what they were becomes available to everyone else. That is, the person disperses back into those constitutive forces. More on that in a bit, but when they do so, we encounter that dispersal as an inner event. That inner event is grief. That is the feeling we experience when someone dies and is being made available to us. Grief is the inner event of the decondensing of the address of a human being. Of course, we don't feel grief at every single death in the world. The closer we are to someone, the more available they become to us. So the more we experience that inner event of grief. Well, let's talk about this a little more so it makes a little more sense. The decondensing of that address of the forces and then the letting go. It's like the same way we weep when we let go of a tightly held thought. Have you ever had that? Like just some pressure that's just in you so long. It's like a clenched fist, and it opens and it releases the pressure, and then suddenly you just cry and you're like, fuck, I didn't know that was so intense, or that was so condensed in me. That was really in there. We cry when we let go. The same thing with an individual when they die. There's an intensity to what they are that condenses them, contracts them into having this human form, and then it lets go, right? And we experience that when the other person dies. Okay, so one more time. Grief is the emotion of the human being being woven back into the constitutive forces. Here's an expression of this from the end of a poem called For Grief by the great Irish writer, priest, philosopher, and poet John O'Donohue. This is the end of that poem. Gradually, you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed. And when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air, and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. So that's, I think, a good bridge between what happens for us when someone dies, and now I'm going to talk about what happens to the one who dies. Plenty occurs there, and it will occur for all of us. Death is the most meaningful experience we ever have. It is the loss of all conditions we know. It is the loss of the conditions of the concentration of the address that we are. And it is also at the same time the gaining of all conditions of the entire world. When you die, you become the forces that once made you. To put it in the words of Rudolf Steiner, the universe constitutes our organs. When we die, the universe constitutes our organs. When this first happens, when we die, we experience how all those constitutive forces relate to each other. So we'll turn to Wittgenstein here. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, he expresses how everything relates to everything else, and it's like you can't pull one Jenga tile out without the whole tower collapsing. There'd be no way to. Everything depends on everything else, and that includes us. Everything is needed to exist. When we die, we experience that radical contingency. So this is why, account after account after account of near-death experiencers, what they say is they experience this pure love, this absolute love, and then they come back and they're like, oh, fuck, I'm in a hospital room or lying on the side of the road or whatever. But they experience this pure love. That pure love is the experience of the contingency. Everything needed us to be for it to be as well. So we experience that unconditional love that is the sign of our absolute neededness.